some are researching other cases, looking for experts to identify. We need an engineering expert. We need people who can counteract whatever Commonwealth Edison is going to present. Because that's what it'll be, factual-based testimony, not, as much as we'd like, not emotional. That's not gonna fly with what the ICC looks at. So we wanna make sure that we prepare our case in the best way that's going to give the best argument for our village and all the residents that are up and down the 390 corridor. There's gonna be a conference call this week to check up with the administrators. Again, they're working this. They're the ones that are actually doing the hands-on work, and they will continue to do that. Luckily, I've called the head of the ICC. He happened to be a former DuPage County board member who I know. I just learned about that last Saturday.
Wow.
So I was like,
That's good.
and again, not going to call him and say, you know, Brian, you gotta be against this. What I want to ask him is, how do we go about doing this? How can my residents present their concerns? How can the village intervene? We have some of that information, but this at least lets him know that we're coming and that we're concerned about this presentation. So I want to get the information on that. We're organizing lists from the Commonwealth Edison hearings. If you've gone and you signed in, they've sent us the names and just the village that you're from. They won't give us any addresses under Privacy Act. And I'm thinking, okay, you came to a public meeting and you signed your name and address. What is the big deal? But we have our resources. We're organizing those lists. If you don't get email blasts from us, please go on our website and sign up for our email news. We're gonna be using that to also blast information. There's another public hearing, Wednesday, 4 to 7 at the American Legion again. Understand, I say hearing, but it really isn't a hearing, it's a dog and pony show by Commonwealth Edison to tell you all about what they plan to do, and there really aren't too many answers coming back. But at least there's force in numbers, people show up, and they know that they've stirred the hornet's nest. There are a lot of people who are upset about this. So, Commonwealth Edison says they're filing in March. So we have some time to work to make sure that we have a solid case. I'm going to hold a resident meeting here on Saturday, February 6th at 9 o'clock. We used to have coffee with the boards every Saturday, and we don't have one in February, so I'm using that time for any residents to come. We're gonna notify everyone that's contacted us. You now know about it. Talk to your neighbors. Anybody who would like to learn more to come to that meeting. By then, we hope that we'll be able to tell you more information. If there is something that you as residents can do, we will give you that information at that time. Trying to think if I've missed anything. Is there anything I've missed, Jeff, on what we've been doing so far? We hope to have more definitive information. Right now, this is fact gathering for us, and we wanna make sure that then you'll have that information. There is also another mayor on the corridor. I've contacted all of our legislators about this, but there is another mayor who is specifically working on trying to get a legislative solution alongside working with the intervention with Commonwealth Edison. So that pretty much brings you up to date. This doesn't happen overnight, and I know that's frustrating because I know many of you are in a state of panic. And it's hard when you don't have all you have are questions and you don't have a lot of answers right now. But please know that I and this village board are committed to walking hand in hand with you and to representing you and to do whatever we can along with the other mayors to try and find a solution. And that's what we want. We want to propose alternative solutions, whether it's a different route, whether it's undergrounding behind your homes, whatever we can find, and that's what we need our experts to help us craft our alternative to the ICC. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. Any board members have a question?
I don't know if not so much a question as a comment is, this kind of came to a surprise at us, if I recall.
Yeah.
Even though they had done the 390 interchange and all that, it just came up after the fact. And I would want to let everyone know here that once the staff found out about it, they mobilized very quickly to try and get as much information for this board as well as prepare for those two meetings that Commonwealth Edison had. So, as the mayor said, we're working to try and make that happen because it came upon us rather quickly as well.
That's a good point.
So the ICC has been characterized as being more money conscious than anything else.
you see that where they would actually listen to other ideas about the rerouting or something based on something more than just money?
They have statutory obligation to follow the statute with regard to these what are called certificates of convenience, which means that there are certain types of evidence and certain types of categories. Sorry about that. The ICC has a statutory obligation that's set forth in Illinois law in terms of what they have to hear regarding evidence associated with whether they should grant or deny a certificate of convenience. One of the things that we should probably make clear is in the past, there has been a greater tendency to grant certificates of convenience than deny them. The ICC has, in the past, been more prone to listen to the utilities position, but I think that that may be in part due to the fact that, number one, there wasn't a lot of law out there in the case law from the appellate courts that dealt with the specific issues associated with these kinds of applications. And the second reason is I think that there is now more evidence associated with what statute does require and what we should attempt to use to prove that the certificate of convenience should not be granted. There is an appellate court case out of our 2nd District Appellate Court in Elgin, which reversed the ICC on the granting of a certificate of convenience that was granted to Commonwealth Edison to extend high-tension power lines. So what that does say is there is a possibility you can prevail in opposition to these. But as a lawyer who deals with these kinds of things, having done administrative hearings, not in front of the ICC, but in front of the Pollution Control Board, it's very clear you better have your ducks in a row, you better have everything organized in the way necessary, and you better be ready to move in a timely fashion. We've already determined that you can intervene in the petition that's filed for the certificate of convenience at any time the petition is pending. But our conclusion or our recommendation is that the intervention be done sooner than later, and the reason for that is this is what's called an administrative proceeding. And when you have an administrative proceeding, what goes into evidence is in evidence, so you can't reverse something that's already there. So you need to be there on the ground in the very initial stages, so you're aware of what's going on, and you can present contrary evidence. You have the ability to do. What Gail's really outlined, what she says is that we, haven't had any experience where the information gathering is. She's telling you we have a preliminary strategy. She's basically saying the strategy we have is to do a number of things at this point to get ready to ultimately effectuate opposition to this in front of the Illinois Commerce Commission. And let me explain a little bit about the Illinois Commerce Commission and how this works. You don't go into the Illinois Commerce Commission and try this case to a bunch of people sitting up on a dais. The hearing itself is conducted by an administrative law judge. The administrative law judge is appointed to hear these types of cases. And they take the evidence, and then after the evidence is completed, they make recommendations of factual findings, and they make recommendations of law to the ICC, and then the ICC decides whether or not they're going to adopt those factual recommendations based on their review of the underlying record. And I know this sounds very foreign, and to people that haven't practiced law, it is very foreign. But that's the way this works. So this ends up in front of the ICC as a bound document, a record. They don't hear the testimony. They don't hear the lawyers. They don't hear the expert witnesses. And you've got an administrative law judge that makes recommendations as to whether he thinks the certificate of convenience should or should not be granted. So what Gail says is basically this strategy has been put in place in terms of the baseline foundation. And Jeff is working with the other managers. Our office has been working with attorneys for Schaumburg as well as Itasca to discuss this to make sure that we understand the law in this area thoroughly. It, in my opinion, will be essential to put together a cadre of qualified experts to provide testimony with regard to the issues that are before the commission. There's strategic decisions that need to be made in this regard. Where do you put your ducks in your basket in terms of your strongest case and your strongest evidence? And is that where you want to focus? You want to go with a shotgun approach in terms of your evidence and see what sticks to the wall after you've pulled the trigger. There's a variety of different complex things that need to be decided. But everything right now, as far as I can tell, is being done to to assemble the information to begin to be able to decide and make the decisions on how to put on that case, which is the village's and its citizens' best defense to the extension of this line. One of the things, for example, there are other communities that have faced this in the past. They've been through this process. We are in contact with those communities to find out exactly what their experience was, how they dealt with it, and to learn by what they did right, and if they did anything wrong, to learn by what they did wrong. So there's really a diligent effort ongoing here, and it's the foundational strategy to move forward. So there's no plan, but there is a plan.
Is there anything we can do as homeowners?
That's the part that we are researching. As I said, the administrative law judge is, if we have show up with 500 people, I don't think that is going to make a bit of difference. He wants the facts. Now, if we can have letters that go into the record, that would be the call to action that we'll put out. If there's a chance to have a public hearing and have residents come to the public hearing, that's the call that we're gonna put out. But those are things that we need to find out.
Homeowners have intervened in these cases in the past, and they have come in. When the homeowners have intervened, if you read the case law, the appellate law that deals with these things, they've actually, the homeowners associations has had witnesses testify, and they've presented their own testimony. And there's certain areas where lay people can present testimony that's competent in these hearings. It's a little premature to sit down and figure out what the best thing to do under the circumstances is. And, but yes, you may be able to help, but I think that at some point in time we'll have, the village will have more specific information as to what it thinks you can do to help. The other thing you can do, of course, is you can always hire a lawyer to represent you in that regard and give you advice in that regard as well. There are not a lot of people out there that are experienced in this area.
Right, so I think from a homeowner point of view, where is it that we wanna be steered, in what direction? So you line up your ducks, but what is duck 1 compared to duck 5? In what order? Because if we're going to ComEd and we go to these open houses, are we feeding them with gasoline so that they can light the match?
No, I don't think so. I think you need to go to these meetings. I think you need to state your opposition. I think ComEd needs to understand that it's in for a fight.
But in
And
what
if it comes from
direction, though,
citizens,
Jim?
if it comes from citizens, as well as what I would characterize as a sound underlying factual basis, and they know that it's gonna be coming at them from both angles, they're dealing with two issues here. They're dealing with a legal issue, which is the primary underlying issue, i.e. do they satisfy the requirements for a certificate of convenience? And they're also to some degree dealing with a political question. And in the past, these things have been subject to some political effects where ComEd has withdrawn an application or perhaps modified a proposal as a result of what they're seeing happening in the community and based on what they see happen. To me, I guess ultimately what I'm saying is it's going to probably end up being a joint mutual process where there's participation from most everyone who's interested. There's nothing that the village can do to say, you have to do this, citizens. It can only make a recommendation in that regard. Certainly, the citizens have their rights to do what they feel is appropriate under the circumstances. I think that the village's focus in front of the ICC will be based on law and evidence, because we view that as the strongest position to work out of, at least in an initial sense, because the ICC has to follow that statute. Now, another thing I want to say though, is there's a lot of discretion in the ICC in the way they approach that statute, how they weigh the various factors associated with what evidence is and is not relevant for purposes of the analysis they have to do to make a decision as to whether or not this certificate of convenience will or will not issue. It's premature right now, Carrie, until we get all of our...
You know exactly what I want.
Yeah, it's premature right now to make a definitive recommendation to you, other than to say, I think that attendance at these meetings is important. Knowing that there's going to be opposition, it's important. ComEd's been down this road many, many times before. And I hate to say this, but they've heard it before,
Yeah.
you know? And and they've probably heard it all before, one way or another. But I still think they need to hear it again, because that may ultimately provide some assistance to them in deciding where they wanna run this line, if they're ultimately gonna do it.
And our goal, Jim, would be, once we find out, we can't tell our residents what to do, however, we can make sure you have the information and the people to contact and the address to write to or the email, whatever it takes for them to contact the ICC, we can get that information to you, and as soon as we have it, we will. Is there anyone?
Assuming that the certificate goes through, or let's just say they're going in March to apply for the certificate, what kind of timeline are we looking at? How long does it take to get a certificate approved? How long does it usually take before the planning stages and they break ground and these poles go up? And how long of a time frame are we looking at? Months, years?
Months, I believe.
We've heard 9 months for typical.
9 months till the
Yeah.
project's to be complete?
From the time of the file to the petition
Approval.
being approved or denied. But that can change depending on intervening in the process.
Yeah, it depends on a lot of different factors, so intervention, how complex the evidence is, what the attorneys do in terms of coming in and saying, we wanna present this evidence, these are the number of witnesses, there's scheduling for the hearing in front of the, administrative law judge. There's a lot of different variables associated, but I've heard that 9 months is a typical time.
To get-
In some
to get
circumstances,
approved?
though, if that's an average, the average may be misleading, averages can be misleading, very misleading, because if you've got a section of lines that's going through a very unpopulated area, and it's going completely down publicly owned land, those may go through in 4 months. And if they put that into the averaging, the 9 months may be skewed, so it could take longer.
What is the timeline that they're saying right now, do you remember?
They were gonna plan to file in March of this year, and then typically they expected a 9 to 12 month process. I think what Jim said is very accurate.
They'll probably say it again Wednesday too.
Yeah.
They'll have all their easels up.
And then how long to build, if it's approved, how long to build it?
Their plans that they've submitted, which everybody can see, I think they look to begin build in 2017 with completion in 2018. That's what they're stating publicly.
Did someone else have a question?
I just kinda had a comment. So, my name's Danny Berg, I'm a Roselle resident for over 20 years. I also am an attorney, but this is out of my realm of practice, but I tried to do a little homework. I'm totally against power lines, grew up near them and totally against them. So one of the questions I have for the board is, if you have not, and I don't know, are we like a home rule municipality?
No.
We're not. Is anybody along the line home rule municipality?
Hanover
affected?
Park, Schaumburg, Elk Grove, those 3 are.
So, if I understand it correctly, maybe I'm completely wrong, but last time I checked, like, there's standards for one of the big issues is EMF emissions coming from high tension poles.
Right.
And it's kind of like an unknown factor.
Right.
There's studies that say that it poses cancer risks. There's some studies that treat it with relatively safe, depending on the magnitude of the EMF emissions coming from the poles. I don't know how up to date we are in the studies, and I don't know that the village necessarily has to hire and get a new study done. I mean, EMF emission studies probably get the most up to date studies. We could probably use them, whatever. But the point is I don't think, the last I checked, that the ICC has set specific standards for ComEd for what EMF emissions, the limits posed to them. Maybe they have, I don't know, but I don't think the ICC limits the EMF emissions that come from the poles. Basically, ComEd's position now has always been, it's safe, don't worry about it, but they're under zero standards, zero regulations for EMF emissions.
Right.
Well, if there is a home rule municipality affected by this project, they can implement their own standards. That's my understanding. I'm not an ICC attorney, but my understanding is that if you're a home rule municipality, you can essentially set your standards, and then the The ICC will have precedence over your standards if they set standards, but they haven't set any standards. This is just food for thought for the board and for whomever you bring in legally, or Jim, for just to throw it out there to think about, just fodder for discussion. The home rule municipalities, since it's not us, but the other ones that we're kind of partnering with, can they set standards? Basically say, no tension pole can come through our municipality unless it meets this criteria, X, Y, and Z.
Legally, we don't know yet. There is an argument that home rule municipalities can do that. Now, there's a couple of different things related to that, and as a lawyer, I'm sure you know that an ordinance
No, don't
has to.
assume I know anything.
Yeah. An ordinance has to be, there's two legal issues related to that at this point. You've identified one indirectly. The first issue is whether or not the ICC can preempt local control in this area, and whether they can do it by a specific ruling as opposed to a general rule. So that's question number one. There's no case law that answers that question at this point. The second issue is whether or not if a home rule municipality adopts an ordinance which limits EMFs, whether it's rationally based.
Right.
And that is a real interesting question, because when you look at the literature on the impacts of EMFs out there, what you find is that the studies seem to establish that there's a correlation between EMFs and certain types of cancers. For example, childhood leukemia is one of the cancers that's identified as having a higher incidence near high tension lines. It's a correlation. However, the people that do the research and come up with those correlations will tell you they cannot scientifically say that the cause has produced that effect. And the reason they do that is there's so many other environmental variables that swirl around these studies. They haven't been able to do enough work to determine whether or not it could be some other environmental factor that causes the increase in leukemia. For example, they used to have asbestos in asphalt. And there's one argument that says your increased rates of cancer are coming from your roads and not from the EMFs. It's an argument. I don't buy it, so don't anybody think so. I'm just trying to point this out to show that this is a complicated. It's a complicated problem. So the answer to your question is, it's unclear at this point. If there's a home rule municipality, though, that wants to slow this thing down at a minimum and to adopt EMF regulations, they certainly can do that. Dimes to dollars, ComEd will litigate that, and they'll try to maintain either that the home rule legislation is preempted, or in the alternative, that it is not rationally based in evidence.
But minimally, if that route is taken, I mean, one of the things that I look at is, okay, you're gonna have, they want high tension poles, and they want to have basically unregulated EMS and to do whatever the hell they wanna do. Minimally, we can, by doing some of the things that you're all talking about, get them to, number one, look at other options. Is there underground, can these, is the technology there to go underground? Would that be a safer
Right, but it
alternative?
still
Is
emits the
cost
same
an issue?
EMFs.
Huh?
It still emits the same
Well, yeah,
EMFs,
yeah,
whether
yeah.
it's underground or whether it's a 170-foot pole.
Yeah,
Well,
it does.
But
You
there's
gotta
other,
shield it.
but there's other issues if you put criteria.
It's shielded,
on
but it's
them.
underground.
Yeah.
If there's
Absolutely
criteria
shielded.
on them, you know, basically make it,
Mhm.
put them where they have to operate according to a standard, and then be held accountable to operating according to that standard. And what that standard, what you said, Jim, about being, you know, you can't willy-nilly just set your own standard. But I'm sure in the United States, there's municipalities that have said, or states, I know some states are really kind of ridiculous standards, they give them a lot of play in it. Some states have
Some states
adopted
have standards
EMF
that are
standards,
needed.
but they're.
Florida, for example.
Florida has
standards
EMF
that are arguably, what's interesting though, and this is recently developed, is the Federal Communications Commission has now set standards on EMF emissions from radio towers.
Look at that. We argued that 20 years ago.
Correct. However, I mean, they're still very, what I characterize as industry favorable, but within certain distances, they have set standards. So, for example, if you're painting a water tower and it's got an array of telecommunications devices on it, there are regulations that say you have to shut those down if you're painting the tower, because depending upon the amount of EMF those are generating, it presents a hazard to the workers. So there is a beginning of some standards out there. Now, whether that standard can be translated to a high-tension power line, don't know. Need to ask the questions, need to look at it. But there are some standards out there that are governmentally based at this point on EMS. I read an article today from the Bureau of Land Management on high-tension lines going through a very empty sector of the West. And it was absolutely fascinating because they were talking about how many EMFs a person has standing on the ground between the person and the ionosphere, and concluded that a person carries 220 volts of static electricity. So there's a lot of crazy work out there that's being done on these things, but nobody seems to have brought it together into what I characterize as a public health standard that everybody's willing to accept. One of the tough things about this, and I'm gonna finish up because I've talked way too much, but one of the tough things about this is there's a realization that if they approve a standard and nothing out there meets the standard, what are you gonna do with all the high tension power lines that run completely across this country everywhere? And that we all rely on in some way or another to get our electricity. So there's a concern there from a liability standpoint. So there's just so much that goes on with regard to these issues, but the village is well underway to taking the stance necessary to do whatever it can to try to stop this from happening.
So how can we protect ourselves then, and protect the citizens that are in 50-foot proximity to these, where they're proposing? How can we say, okay, we go out and we do a study for EMFs along this corridor, several sections of this corridor. So that would include asbestos from the asphalt from 390. So how can we protect ourselves? We have a reading, a milligauss reading here, we have a milligauss reading here, we have a milligauss reading here. We go on the north side, we do the exact same thing.
In the absence of actual standards established by a unit of government, the answer to the question is there's no clear, easy way to protect yourself at this point other than to fight, and fight it with the maximum amount of information you could put together to show that this particular project does not conform to the statutory requirements that the Commerce Commission is obligated to follow in these circumstances. If you're looking for a black and white answer, you will not find it. I hate to say that,
Right,
but you know,
so
I
they
gotta be
put out
honest
these-
about this. I'm not gonna sit up here and paint a picture of, you know, all is well and, you know, this is a dead bang winner. I'd be lying if I said it.
There has to be some technology to limit ComEd to the milligauss, like you said, that emits off the line. You know, see, ComEd's thing, and I've read this, ComEd doesn't care how much electricity it loses. It's cheaper for them just to run more electricity through the lines than to have criteria that limits them. They can provide, it has nothing to do with service. It's the same service. It's just that it's much cheaper for them to run, to like, let water flow out. It doesn't matter. They don't care about the waste of electricity. Unfortunately, that's what's going to the neighborhoods, that, you know, that whole corridor of homes within a half a mile are gonna get that EMF emission. So, but I'm wondering also about a dialogue with ComEd to see about, before actually having the ICC even decided, but can it be put in a posture of dialogue with them about, you know, realistically you know, short of, you know, giving in to them, but at least exploring options of limiting all of that excess electricity that's gonna flow down
We've already had that meeting with Commonwealth Edison, all the mayors along the corridor, plus our administrators, other staff members. First of all, you need to know what they're planning. They're planning to put this down the south side of 390 right now. In the future, they're gonna duplicate it along the north side. And it's not for reliability now, it's for future capacity and growth. We've asked them, do you have an alternative route? Why can't you go to the Wayne substation instead of coming from Bartlett all the way through to the Itasca station? And their answer is, it wouldn't give them what they are going for the future. That's not acceptable to us.
Right.
I mean, to help 6,000 people who have
They're a full
occasional brownout or blackout for a day or two, to put this line through all of our communities with all of our residents being affected, that's not an acceptable answer. Now we have to prove it logically and we have to prove it with facts. So that's what we're doing.
Well, it'll be a maximum of 756 kilovolts. I mean, that's the max.
Yeah.
If it goes both on the south and the north side.
I don't know if you have enough time to talk about all of these, but I just wanted to highlight what I'm hearing is like the health was certainly one issue that we're thinking about. So that's a viable option to protest it by the health concerns that we have. We also have.
That's not the strongest argument, just so
But
you know.
there's safety with IDOT, if they're anywhere close to the road, there would be
Yes.
property, loss of property values, should we have all these houses assessed before the lines go in and then have them compensate our residents for the loss of value? And also, do these lines go across a village street where we have control over the air rights over the street? When they cross Plum Grove Road, can we say, hey, you can't cross Plum Grove Road? The FAA is another one, because I know they wanna fly into Schaumburg Air Park, by controls. So that would be another one, and then, I think, Mayor, you said something like it, there's a lot of high tension wires going all over the suburbs, and they can't take a spur line to one of those areas and run the lines down where already the lines exist, to Addison, heading into Itasca, maybe going down 355 instead of, because 355 on the west side is all industrial.
Right.
So I didn't get a feeling when I went to see ComEd that they had any other options, and that they said, this is what we were gonna do, but this is why we have to do it in Roselle. They just said, this is why we're gonna do it in Roselle.
No.
And I'm not so sure that they explored all the options, especially from a human element.
Well, that's our charge, is to make sure we get people who can look at the other options and come up with something else that's less obtrusive to residents along the whole corridor, and still get Commonwealth Edison some extra power.
Minimize the effect, even if it's necessary. I mean, we're not saying we don't want to have progress in this world, but, you know, you go to other countries and they spend a lot of time undergrounding and building roads through mountains instead of around them, and, you know, they do a lot of things that maybe we don't do as people do for each other.
But ComEd doesn't have to present that to the ICC.
No.
That's not part of.
I know, that's the
Right,
problem,
sure.
because all they have to do is say,
Exactly.
this is the cheapest way through your backyard.
That's exactly right.
Patrick?
Thank you, Mayor. I think another point is, besides what we've been hearing, is the frustration coming from ComEd on the inconsistencies. Having 4 representatives in the room, having 4 different stories of where exactly these towers are gonna be on the north side and south side. I know you briefly touched upon it. Would you be able to speak, or maybe Jeff, on, are they looking to have it on the north side of the retaining wall, on the north side of the?
Oh, you mean north and south of retaining wall?
Well, they've been
Yeah.
going back and forth, we get.
Well, it will go back and forth. There will be
Okay.
some poles that are going to be between the retaining wall or the sound barrier and the road. Others are going to be between the sound barrier and village's property line. Because Commonwealth Edison's line undulates back and forth.
Okay, so,
One of the things they've done in the past, just so you know, this is a Commonwealth Edison strategy that they've used. One of the things they've done is they'll go to the ICC and they'll say, we wanna build our lines and they have to be within 375 feet of the center line of the road. We're not gonna tell you where we're gonna put it specifically, it just has to be within 375 feet of the center line of the road. That's very, very disturbing, because it gives them a lot of discretion as they move down the roads where they're actually gonna put this thing, as opposed to telling people specifically where they want it. That was the thing that hung them up in the Second District Appellate Court. So in this particular case, specific location is something that should really be pushed from the onset, from a strategy standpoint in these kinds of matters, because at least there's some case law out there that says that's a relevant consideration when the ICC decides what they want to do with one of these things. That makes sense in the context of the statute.
okay, so at this time, at the open houses, should they be,
They have said even when they, file with the ICC, they don't have to put the exact locations of the poles. That's sort of a detail that will come along later. I mean, It's been absolutely infuriating, but.
Yeah, that's what.
No, we need to see a plan.
So, that's what you'll find, please, if you have friends, neighbors, I don't care if it's your cousin from Iowa, bring them to the Commonwealth, they need to see that people are concerned, people are upset, people do not want this in Roselle. So any of your neighbors that you can bring along, whether you're on the north or south side of the road, because even though it might be going down, the proposal is for the south side, if they get approval, guess what? It's coming down the north side eventually, and we would like to stop it in its tracks before it even gets down the south side. That's our goal. So,
And they also said they couldn't put it down the center of the road because they might go with light rail one day down that road.
right,
But you guys should all go Wednesday.
yeah.
They outnumber us if you don't show up. There's so
Well,
many of
oh
them.
yeah, I went to the first one.
Yeah.
4 o'clock, they had more.
More red jackets.
Minions. These were interns at a standard thing, they were saying.
Absolutely.
Standard.
That's what the mayor said, it was a dog and pony show.
Yeah, it was. We did, and one of our former trustees brought this to our attention, there was a village of Lincolnwood. They fought Commonwealth Edison, now it happened 25 years ago. And we haven't been able to, we were researching to find out what happened after that. But they did have a very lengthy fight against Commonwealth Edison. We're using the information to help us form our strategy. But if you're interested in reading it, you have to go to the chicagoreader.com and you just put high tension and it should come, or Lincolnwood, and it should come up. If you're interested in reading it, just to have some background information. We're not in for an easy fight, but we're determined to do the best we can to try and stop this.
I would think that Lincolnwood would be a non-home rule.
They were
I wouldn't think that they would.
Yeah, they were not,
They were not.
they were talking about passing an ordinance
They
limiting
talked about
EMFs,
it.
and as far as I can tell, they never did, because I can't find any evidence that they
But
did.
the article does discuss how ComEd came to the table and agreed to limit the
Exactly,
megawatt.
and that's why I was saying, that's why, exercising every element of the defense is an element of the defense. It's the simplest way to put it. That article is really good and interesting, though.
Gives you a lot of information.
Gives you a lot of information on how complex this is,
Yeah.
gives you a lot of information about strategies that have been used. It is dated a little bit, but unfortunately, when you try to follow up on how dated it is, it seems that there's a lot of contemporary information there as well.
In terms
So
of
it's a good
the
read.
EMF health criteria, it doesn't seem to have changed much.
It doesn't seem to have changed much on the
91.
EMF much. Yeah, it doesn't.
Okay, one last comment here?
I just wanted to say, that's what I was talking about our defense. If you have a milligauss number now, and then you have something close to when they're gonna put the poles up, I mean, you have concrete evidence.
We've got evidence.
You're looking for evidence,
Yes.
right? Factual
Right, the
evidence.
question will be, and this is where the problem was, what's the relationship between the, amount of milligauss and the health risks? That's what the question is. If you read the article,